Welcome, and thanks for being here. You can get comfortable. There's nothing you need to do right now. No need to focus too much. Just let the words be in the background. Some thoughts might catch your attention, others might drift away, and that's perfectly fine. If you enjoy this kind of calm space, you can leave a like to support the channel and subscribe if you'd like to come back again. It really helps, and it keeps this space going. For now, just take it easy. Let the sound settle, let the day fade a little, and allow yourself to rest.
Before we try to answer anything, it helps to slow down and notice what is already happening. Right now, there is an experience taking place. Not a thought about experience, not a description of it, but the simple fact of being aware. Sounds may come and go. The body may feel heavy or light. Thoughts may drift in the background. None of this requires effort. Awareness is already there, quietly present, without asking to be explained. This is where the question begins. When we ask whether consciousness is really a product of the brain, we are not asking about intelligence, memory, or behavior. We are asking about this immediate sense of being here at all, the feeling of having an inner world. Science tells us a great deal about the brain. We know it processes information, coordinates movement, stores memories, and responds to the environment. Electrical signals move through networks of neurons. Chemical messengers adjust mood and attention. Damage to specific areas changes perception and personality. All of this is well supported, and yet none of it directly explains why experience feels like something from the inside. A brain can be described in detail from the outside, but experience is always known from within. This gap is subtle but important. When we say the brain produces consciousness, we are making an assumption that activity becomes experience at some point. But where does that shift happen? At which signal, at which connection, does a physical process turn into the feeling of seeing, hearing, or simply being aware? This is not a criticism of science, it is a recognition of its limits. Science is excellent at describing mechanisms. Consciousness, however, is not a mechanism we observe, it is the observing itself. This makes the question unusually difficult. The brain can be measured, scanned, and mapped. Consciousness cannot be placed on a screen. It does not appear as an object. It is the space in which objects appear. Because of this, the question has remained open for a long time. Some researchers believe consciousness emerges from complexity, that when enough processes interact, awareness naturally appears. Others suggest the brain does not create consciousness, but shapes or filters it, like a receiver tuning into something more fundamental. There are also views that avoid a clear answer altogether, suggesting that consciousness may be inseparable from the fabric of reality itself. At this stage, none of these ideas need to be accepted or rejected. For now, it is enough to sit with the question without trying to solve it, to notice that awareness does not feel mechanical, even if it depends on a physical brain. It feels immediate, continuous, and oddly familiar. As we move forward, we will explore these ideas gently, without forcing conclusions. There is no need to decide what consciousness is right now. Simply noticing that it is here, quietly present, is enough to begin.
Instead of starting with theories, it helps to notice how natural awareness feels. There is nothing unusual about it while it is happening. It does not announce itself or ask to be examined. It simply stays present,
even when attention moves elsewhere. This familiarity is important because it often hides how strange consciousness actually is. We can observe thoughts, emotions, and sensations coming and going, but the awareness in which they appear does not seem to come or go in the same way. It feels continuous, even when its contents change. From a scientific perspective, this is puzzling. The brain is constantly changing. Neurons fire, chemicals fluctuate, networks reconfigure themselves moment by moment, and yet experience feels unified. There is one stream, not millions of separate signals. When we look at the brain, we see complexity and fragmentation. When we look at experience, we find coherence. This does not automatically mean the brain is not the source of consciousness, but it raises an important question. How does something so divided produce something that feels whole? Neuroscience can point to integration mechanisms, to networks that bind information together. These explanations describe coordination, but they still describe activity, not experience itself. Coordination explains how signals align, not why alignment is accompanied by feeling. This is where many explanations begin to feel incomplete. We can say that consciousness correlates with brain activity, and this is clearly true. Certain brain states reliably match certain experiences. But correlation is not the same as creation. A radio signal correlates with sound, but the radio does not create the broadcast. It receives and shapes it. This analogy is often controversial, but it illustrates the core uncertainty. Is the brain generating consciousness, or is it organizing something that already exists? At the same time, it is equally difficult to imagine consciousness floating freely without any physical structure. When the brain is deeply altered, experience changes or disappears. This suggests dependence, but dependence does not necessarily imply origin. The relationship may be more subtle. Consciousness might require the brain without being produced by it in the simplest sense. At this point, the goal is not to choose a side. It is to recognize how unusual the situation is. We are using consciousness to investigate consciousness. The observer and the observed are not fully separate. This alone makes the question different from most scientific problems. As we continue, we will move slowly through these ideas, not to force an answer, but to understand why the question has remained open for so long, and why it continues to matter, even without a final conclusion. Imagine trying to explain color to someone who has never seen it, using only numbers and measurements. You could describe wavelengths, frequencies, and neural responses in perfect detail, yet something essential would still be missing. Consciousness presents a similar problem. We can describe what the brain does when experience happens, but the description never seems to become the experience itself. This gap is often where confusion begins. The brain is made of physical components, interacting according to physical laws. Consciousness, however, is not encountered as a physical object. It is encountered as immediacy, as presence, as the simple fact that something is being felt at all. This difference does not automatically mean the brain is irrelevant. It means the relationship may not be straightforward. When neuroscientists map brain activity, they find reliable patterns. Visual experience aligns with activity in visual areas. Emotions align with changes in specific networks. Attention shifts correlate with measurable signals. These findings are real and valuable, but they describe structure and function, not experience itself. The description stays on one side of the bridge. Experience stays on the other. The question is whether that bridge is incomplete or whether it leads somewhere we do not yet know how to walk. Some theories suggest that consciousness emerges when information reaches a certain level of complexity or integration. According to these views, once the brain becomes complex enough, awareness simply appears, like heat emerging from molecular motion. This idea is appealing because it fits within a physical framework, but emergence is not an explanation so much as a label. Saying that consciousness emerges tells us when it might appear, not why it feels the way it does. Others argue that consciousness is fundamental, like space, time, or energy. In this view, the brain does not create consciousness any more than a mirror creates light. It reflects, organizes, and limits it. This idea is harder to test, but it avoids the problem of turning matter into experience. Still, it raises new questions. Why does consciousness seem tied so closely to brains? Why does damage disrupt it so reliably? Why does awareness fade when the brain sleeps or shuts down? These questions keep the debate grounded. They prevent easy answers on either side. What becomes clear at this stage is that the problem is not a lack of data, but a mismatch of categories. Physical explanations describe processes. Consciousness is not experienced as a process, it is experienced as presence. Until those two perspectives can be reconciled, the question will remain open. And perhaps that openness is not a failure. It may be an invitation to rethink what explanation means when the thing being explained is the very condition that allows explanation to happen at all. Instead of asking where consciousness comes from, it can be useful to ask a quieter question. What exactly would it mean for the brain to produce experience? Production usually implies a transformation. Something becomes something else. Wood becomes heat. Motion becomes sound. But in each of these cases, the transformation stays within the same category. Physical processes turn into other physical effects. Consciousness does not obviously fit this pattern. A neural signal does not resemble a feeling in any direct way. Voltage does not look like color. Chemical exchange does not sound like music. This does not make production impossible, but it makes it conceptually strange. The brain clearly plays a role in shaping experience. Change the brain and experience changes. This is undeniable. But shaping is not the same as originating. A lens shapes light without creating it. A filter shapes sound without generating the signal. These comparisons are imperfect, but they help highlight the uncertainty. When experience changes with brain states, we see dependence, not necessarily origin. The difficulty is that we have no direct access to experience without a brain to compare it to. Every observation we make is already filtered through neural structure. This makes it hard to tell whether consciousness is generated or constrained by the brain. Another challenge is that consciousness does not scale the way physical production usually does. Doubling neurons does not double awareness. Increasing brain activity does not always increase clarity. Sometimes it does the opposite. Intense activity can fragment experience rather than enrich it. This suggests that consciousness is not simply the sum of its parts. Something about it resists straightforward accumulation. Even when brain activity is reduced, such as in certain meditative or near-sleep states, experience can feel expansive rather than diminished. This complicates the idea that more brain activity always means more consciousness. It hints that awareness may not be directly proportional to neural output. At this point, no conclusion is required. The goal is to notice how unusual the problem is. Consciousness does not behave like a typical product. It does not increase linearly. It does not appear as an object. It does not remain fixed when its supposed generator fluctuates wildly. These observations do not disprove the brain-based view, but they do suggest that the relationship is more subtle than simple cause and effect. As we continue, we will explore how this subtlety has led some thinkers to rethink not just consciousness, but the assumptions we make about matter, explanation, and what it means for something to exist at all. If consciousness were only a byproduct of brain activity, we might expect it to behave like other byproducts. Heat fades when motion stops. Sound disappears when vibration ends. But consciousness does not always follow this pattern. There are moments when brain activity decreases, yet awareness does not vanish. In some cases, it becomes quieter, clearer, or more expansive. This does not mean the brain is inactive. It means the relationship between activity and experience is not simple. Less activity does not always mean less awareness. Sometimes it means less noise. This observation has led researchers to examine states where the brain is not operating at full intensity. Deep sleep, meditation, anesthesia, and altered states all show reduced or reorganized activity. Yet experience does not always disappear completely. Dreams arise during sleep. Awareness can remain during certain meditative states. Even under anesthesia, fragments of experience sometimes persist. These states challenge the idea that consciousness depends directly on the level of neural firing. They suggest that organization matters more than quantity. How the brain is active may be more important than how much it is active. This opens another possibility. The brain may not be producing consciousness in the way a machine produces output. It may be regulating access to it. When activity is chaotic, awareness feels fragmented. When activity is coherent, awareness feels unified. When activity quiets, awareness may feel spacious. This view does not deny the importance of the brain. It reframes its role. Instead of being a generator, it becomes a modulator. Still, this idea raises difficult questions. If consciousness exists independently, why does it disappear when the brain is severely damaged? Why does awareness not persist clearly after death? These questions remain unanswered, but they point toward a relationship that is conditional rather than absolute. Consciousness may require certain structures to express itself clearly. Without those structures, it may not be accessible in any meaningful way. At this stage, what becomes clear is that neither extreme position fully explains the evidence. Consciousness does not behave like a simple output, but it also does not float free of the brain. It appears to exist in a delicate balance between dependence and independence. Understanding that balance may be more important than choosing a side. As we continue, we will look at how this balance affects our sense of self, memory, and identity, and why these experiences feel so closely tied to consciousness itself. As the question deepens, attention naturally turns toward the sense of self. Consciousness is not just awareness of sights or sounds, it is also the feeling of being someone who is aware. This sense of self feels stable, continuous, and personal. Yet when we look for it in the brain, we do not find a single location where it lives. There is no center labeled self. Instead, there are many processes working together. Memory, emotion, perception, and attention all contribute. When one of these processes changes, the sense of self shifts. Injury can alter personality. Memory loss can erase identity. Mood can color the entire sense of who one feels like being. This suggests that the self is constructed. But construction does not necessarily mean illusion. A melody is constructed from notes, yet it is real as an experience. The self may be similar. It may be a pattern rather than a thing. Consciousness, in this view, is not a static object, but a dynamic field in which patterns appear. The brain shapes these patterns by organizing information across time. It binds moments together, creating the feeling of continuity. Without memory, awareness would still exist, but it would not feel personal. Without emotion, awareness would feel flat. Without attention, it would feel scattered. The brain may be responsible for weaving these elements together. This would explain why consciousness feels unified even though its components are distributed. It also explains why the self feels real but difficult to locate. It is not stored anywhere, it is enacted. This view aligns with the idea that consciousness is not a thing the brain produces, but a process the brain participates in. The brain provides structure, timing, and limitation. Consciousness provides presence. Together, they create experience as it is lived. Still, this does not resolve the core mystery. Why does this process feel like something from the inside? Why is there experience at all, rather than empty processing? The self may be constructed, but the awareness in which it appears remains unexplained. As we move forward, this distinction will become increasingly important. Understanding the self may tell us how consciousness is shaped, but it may not tell us why consciousness exists in the first place.
When the sense of self becomes quiet, something interesting happens. Awareness does not disappear with it. In moments when attention relaxes, when thought slows, or when the usual story of me fades into the background, experience often remains clear. There is still seeing, still hearing, still a sense of presence, but without strong identification. This suggests that consciousness and the self are not the same thing. The self may be something that appears within consciousness, rather than its source. From a neurological perspective, this makes sense. The networks associated with self-referential thinking can quiet down, while other networks remain active. Yet from the inside, the experience feels less cluttered rather than diminished. This challenges the idea that consciousness is built upward from the self. Instead, it hints that the self is layered on top of a more basic awareness. If this is true, then the brain's role may be less about creating awareness and more about structuring it into a personal narrative. This narrative is useful. It allows planning, memory, and social interaction. But it may not be required for awareness itself. Infants, animals, and even simple organisms appear to have some form of experience without a complex sense of identity. This raises the possibility that consciousness exists in degrees, while the self is something that develops later. If awareness can exist without a strong self, then consciousness may be more fundamental than personal identity. The brain then becomes the place where awareness is shaped into something human, something autobiographical. This framing softens the original question. Instead of asking whether the brain produces consciousness, we might ask what layers the brain adds to consciousness. Sensory detail, memory, emotion, perspective, and continuity all seem to depend on neural structure, but the bare fact of experience may not. This does not mean consciousness exists independently in a clear or accessible way without the brain. It means the brain may be responsible for making consciousness local, specific, and personal. As we continue, this distinction will guide the discussion away from extremes and toward a more nuanced view, where consciousness is neither fully generated nor completely separate, but something that takes shape at the boundary between brain, body, and world. Another way to approach the question is to notice how seamlessly consciousness adapts to different conditions. When the body is tired, awareness feels heavy. When the body is alert, awareness feels sharp. When the senses are overloaded, experience becomes narrow. When stimulation is reduced, experience can feel wide and open. Consciousness seems to follow the state of the system it is connected to, adjusting its tone without losing its presence. This adaptability suggests a close relationship with the brain and body, but it also suggests flexibility rather than rigid production. If consciousness were only an output, we might expect it to switch on and off cleanly. Instead, it shifts, bends, and reshapes itself. This fluidity is difficult to explain purely in mechanical terms. Neural activity can change quickly, but the continuity of awareness feels smooth. Even when experience fragments, something remains that notices the fragmentation. This noticing does not feel broken in the same way signals can be. From the inside, there is a sense of continuity that survives many kinds of disruption. This continuity is not constant in content, but it is constant in presence. The brain clearly influences what appears in consciousness, but it is less clear that it creates the space in which appearances happen. That space feels more like a condition than a product. At the same time, consciousness without structure would be meaningless. Pure awareness without form would not be recognizable as experience. The brain may be what gives awareness shape, contrast, and limitation. It may carve experience into moments, perspectives, and identities. This would explain why changes in the brain reliably change experience without requiring that the brain generate awareness from nothing. Consciousness and brain activity may be intertwined in a way that resists simple hierarchy. One may not come first in a clean causal sense. Instead, they may arise together, each defining the other. As we move forward, this intertwined view will help us explore theories that treat consciousness as something relational, something that exists not in the brain alone, but in the interaction between brain, body, and environment, unfolding moment by moment without a clear point of origin.
At this point, it becomes clear that the difficulty is not just scientific, but conceptual. We are trying to explain experience using tools that were designed to describe objects. Neurons, signals, chemicals, and networks are all things that can be measured from the outside. Consciousness is never encountered that way. It is always known from within. This difference creates a blind spot. No matter how detailed a brain model becomes, it remains a description. Experience is not a description. It is the thing being described. This does not make science wrong. It makes the problem unusual. When we study the brain, we are looking at the conditions under which consciousness appears. We are not looking at consciousness itself. This is why explanations often feel close, yet incomplete. They explain how information is processed, but not why processing is accompanied by experience. Some researchers suggest that this gap is temporary, that future theories will bridge it. Others suggest that the gap is structural, that subjective experience cannot be reduced to objective description in principle. If this is true, then asking whether consciousness is a product of the brain may be the wrong question. It may assume a one-way relationship that does not exist. Consciousness might not be produced in the same way things are produced. It might be more like a perspective that emerges whenever certain conditions are met. The brain would then be one of those conditions, not the sole source. This would explain why similar patterns of awareness appear across different species, and why consciousness seems to scale gradually rather than appearing suddenly. It would also explain why we cannot point to a single moment in evolution when consciousness switched on. Instead, awareness may deepen as systems become more capable of integrating information. This view does not solve the mystery, but it reframes it. It shifts the focus from origin to relationship. How do physical systems relate to experience? What kinds of structures allow awareness to take form? As we continue, this relational perspective will help us explore ideas that move beyond simple production models without abandoning the insights neuroscience has already given us.
When we look closely, the question of consciousness begins to soften into something less confrontational. It stops being a debate about ownership and becomes a question about participation. The brain is clearly involved. Without it, the familiar form of human experience does not arise. Perception fades, memory dissolves, identity loosens. And yet, involvement does not automatically mean authorship. A musical instrument is essential for music to be heard, but it is not the music itself. The relationship is intimate but not identical. Consciousness may stand in a similar relation to the brain. The brain provides timing, structure, and limitation. Consciousness provides immediacy, presence, and feeling. Together, they create lived experience. Separating them cleanly may be impossible. Not because one produces the other, but because they co-define each other. This idea helps explain why the search for a single seat of consciousness in the brain has been unsuccessful. There is no point where experience suddenly appears. Instead, there are conditions that support it. When those conditions weaken, experience changes. When they strengthen, experience becomes richer. But the presence of awareness itself never shows up as a physical object. It remains the background against which all objects appear. This background is easy to ignore because it is always there. It does not stand out. It does not compete. Yet without it, nothing could be noticed at all. The brain may be the interface through which this background becomes personal, local, and meaningful. It turns raw awareness into a point of view. This does not require us to assume that consciousness exists independently in a mystical sense. It only requires us to accept that not everything real is an object. Some things are conditions. Some things are contexts. Consciousness may be one of those. As we move forward, this shift in perspective will allow us to explore ideas that treat consciousness not as a thing the brain makes, but as something that becomes visible whenever the right kind of organization is present. At some point, the discussion naturally reaches the limits of language itself. Words are excellent at pointing to things, actions, and relationships, but consciousness is not easily pointed to. It is not over there. It is not inside an object. It is the condition in which pointing happens at all. This makes every explanation feel slightly indirect. We describe around the edges, hoping the center will become clear on its own. The brain, by contrast, fits language well. It has parts, locations, and functions. We can name regions, measure activity, and track changes. This difference often makes the brain feel more real than consciousness, even though consciousness is the only thing we ever directly know. This reversal is easy to miss. We trust descriptions more than presence because descriptions can be shared and verified. Experience cannot be handed over in the same way. It must be lived. This does not make it unreliable. It makes it private. The privacy of consciousness is one of the reasons the question remains unresolved. Science progresses through shared observation. Consciousness is never shared directly, only inferred. We assume others are conscious because their behavior resembles ours. This assumption works, but it leaves a gap. No scan or measurement ever shows experience itself. It shows conditions correlated with it. This does not mean consciousness is outside science forever. It means the tools may need to change. New frameworks may be required, ones that treat experience not as an object to be detected, but as a fundamental feature to be accounted for. Until then, explanations will continue to circle the mystery without landing on it. This circling is not failure. It is what careful inquiry looks like when the subject resists simplification. Consciousness may not be something that can be reduced without being lost. If so, the goal shifts. Instead of trying to pin it down completely, we learn to describe its relationships, its patterns, and its limits. The brain remains central in this picture, not as a factory of awareness, but as the most complex known structure through which awareness takes shape. And as we continue, this view allows the question to remain open without becoming empty, holding curiosity steady without demanding closure.
As the question stays open, something else becomes noticeable. The need for a final answer begins to feel less urgent. Not because the question is unimportant, but because consciousness is always already present while the question is being asked. Awareness does not wait for theory. It does not depend on explanation to exist. This changes the emotional tone of the problem. Instead of feeling like a puzzle that must be solved, it begins to feel like a condition that can be explored. The brain can be studied, theories can be built, models can improve, but awareness itself remains immediate and accessible, regardless of how much we understand about it. This creates a quiet contrast. The science of consciousness moves slowly. Experience happens instantly. One is cumulative. The other is always now. This difference may be why the question feels so persistent. No matter how far explanations go, they never replace the fact of experience. They only sit beside it. The brain may explain patterns in awareness, but it does not replace awareness. This suggests a different kind of relationship. Knowledge about consciousness does not deepen consciousness itself. It changes how we think about it, not how we experience it. This is unusual. Learning about vision changes how we understand seeing, but it does not change the act of seeing. Learning about memory changes how we think about remembering, but not the feeling of remembering. Consciousness seems to remain untouched by its explanations. This hints that it occupies a different category than the things used to explain it. Not higher, not lower, just different. The brain belongs to the world of objects and processes. Consciousness belongs to the world of presence and experience. These worlds overlap, but they are not identical. The overlap is where the mystery lives. As we continue, the question will not move toward a single conclusion, but toward a deeper understanding of why a single conclusion may not be possible. Consciousness may not be something that fits into a final definition. It may be something that stays open by its nature, not because of ignorance, but because it is the condition that allows anything to be known in the first place.
As the discussion unfolds, it becomes clear that consciousness resists being placed neatly on one side of a boundary. It is not entirely inside the brain, yet it does not exist clearly outside of it either. This in-between quality is part of what makes the question so enduring. The brain and consciousness appear to arise together in experience, intertwined in a way that makes separation feel artificial. When the brain changes, experience changes. When experience changes, the way the brain is used also changes. This mutual influence suggests a relationship rather than a hierarchy. Instead of one producing the other, they may be participating in a shared process. Consciousness might be what it feels like when certain kinds of organization are present. The brain would then be the most refined example of that organization we know. This view does not deny physical reality, it expands it. It allows experience to be considered a real aspect of the universe, not an illusion or a side effect, but a feature that appears under specific conditions. If this is the case, then asking whether consciousness is a product of the brain becomes similar to asking whether movement is a product of space. Movement requires space, but it is not manufactured by it. Space allows movement to occur. In the same way, the brain may allow consciousness to appear in a focused personal form. Without the brain, that form may not exist, but that does not mean awareness itself is created from nothing. This perspective shifts attention away from origin stories and toward conditions. What kinds of systems allow experience? What kinds of organization give rise to presence? These questions are less rigid and more exploratory. They accept that consciousness may not have a single cause, but a set of relationships. As time goes on, this relational view continues to gain interest, not because it answers everything, but because it respects the complexity of the problem without forcing it into a simplified frame.
As we follow this line of thought, the idea of consciousness as something local begins to loosen. Local things have clear boundaries. They can be pointed to, measured, isolated. Consciousness does not behave this way in experience. It does not feel contained in a specific place. It does not feel like it has edges.
The body can be located, sensations can be localized, thoughts can be traced to topics, but awareness itself feels spread out, open, without a clear center. This has led some thinkers to suggest that consciousness may not be strictly inside the brain, even if it depends on the brain to take a human form. From this perspective, the brain acts less like a container and more like a focusing system. It narrows something broad into something specific. This would explain why different brains seem to host different experiences while sharing similar underlying qualities. Awareness feels personal, but its basic character feels familiar across individuals. The difference may lie in structure rather than substance. The brain structures experience into perspective, memory, and identity. Consciousness provides the capacity for experience itself. This framing avoids treating consciousness as a mysterious substance floating around in the universe. It treats it as a fundamental aspect of reality that becomes visible under certain organizational conditions. Just as temperature becomes meaningful when particles interact in particular ways, consciousness may become meaningful when information is integrated in certain patterns. The brain would then be one such pattern, not the sole origin. This view remains speculative, but it helps explain why consciousness appears continuous even as brain states fluctuate. It also explains why awareness can feel stable even when thoughts, emotions, and sensations change rapidly. The structure shifts, but the field remains. As we continue, this distinction between structure and presence will help clarify why consciousness feels both dependent on the brain and somehow more than it, without forcing us into an all-or-nothing conclusion.
At this stage, it becomes helpful to look at how consciousness behaves when the usual structures are altered. Consider moments of deep absorption, when attention is fully engaged in a task, or moments of quiet reflection, when thoughts slow almost to a stop. In both cases, awareness remains, but its contents change dramatically. Sometimes experience feels narrow and focused. Other times it feels wide and open. These shifts can happen without any clear change in external conditions. This suggests that consciousness is flexible in form but stable in presence. The brain appears to adjust the shape of experience rather than turning awareness on or off. This supports the idea that consciousness is not a simple output that increases or decreases like volume. It is more like a space that can be filled in different ways. The brain determines what fills that space. Sensory input, memory, emotion, and imagination all come and go, but the capacity for experience itself remains constant. This constancy is easy to overlook because it is always there. We notice changes in content, not the background that allows content to appear. Neuroscience often focuses on these contents because they can be measured, but the background remains elusive. This does not mean it is unreal. It means it does not behave like an object. When brain networks reorganize, the style of experience changes. When they fragment, experience feels scattered. When they synchronize, experience feels unified. These patterns suggest a strong relationship between neural organization and the quality of consciousness, but they do not fully explain the existence of consciousness itself. They explain modulation, not creation. As we move forward, this distinction will become increasingly important. The brain may be the instrument through which consciousness expresses itself, but the presence of awareness may not be reducible to the instrument alone.
Understanding this may not give us a final answer, but it may give us a more accurate question, one that respects both the power of neuroscience and the irreducible immediacy of experience itself.
When we follow this line of thought far enough, the idea of consciousness as a byproduct starts to feel less convincing. Byproducts usually appear unintentionally, as leftovers of a process whose main purpose lies elsewhere. Consciousness does not feel like a leftover. It feels central. Everything we value, understand, or question happens within it. If the brain evolved only to process information efficiently, consciousness appears as a strangely prominent feature to be merely incidental. This does not mean evolution had a goal to create awareness, but it does raise the question of why awareness is so deeply woven into every aspect of experience. The brain could, in theory, perform many functions without subjective feeling, at least as far as external behavior is concerned. And yet, experience is always present from the inside. This suggests that consciousness may not be an accidental side effect, but an integral part of how complex systems operate when they reach a certain level of organization. The brain may not produce consciousness in the same way a factory produces goods. It may enable a mode of being in which information is not only processed, but felt. Feeling may be what integrated information is like from the inside. This idea shifts the problem again. Consciousness becomes less mysterious substance and more perspective. Not something added on top of processes, but the inner aspect of those processes themselves. From this view, asking whether consciousness is produced by the brain is like asking whether the inside of a storm is produced by the weather patterns. The storm and its interior are not separate events. They are two ways of describing the same phenomenon. Still, this analogy has limits. We can observe storms from the outside. Consciousness cannot be observed that way. We only ever encounter it from within. This asymmetry keeps the mystery alive. But it also suggests that the mystery may be unavoidable, not because we lack data, but because consciousness occupies a unique position. It is both what we study and what we study with. As we continue, this realization will guide us away from the search for a single source and toward an appreciation of consciousness as something that arises wherever complex integrated processes meet the capacity for experience. As the view continues to shift, another possibility comes into focus. Consciousness may not be something added to the brain at all, but something that appears automatically when certain relationships are in place. Not produced, not injected, but revealed. When information is integrated, when signals refer back to one another, when a system models both the world and itself, experience may arise naturally. From this angle, consciousness is not a substance or a product. It is a condition, a way reality appears to itself under specific circumstances. The brain, then, is not a generator, but a highly refined environment in which this condition can emerge clearly. This helps explain why consciousness seems gradual rather than binary. There was no clear moment when awareness suddenly switches on. Instead, it deepens, stabilizes, and becomes more complex as organization increases. This also explains why simpler systems may have simpler forms of experience, while more complex systems have richer ones. Consciousness would not belong exclusively to humans, but would vary in degree across living systems. This idea feels unsettling to some because it challenges the uniqueness of human awareness. But it also removes the need for a sharp boundary that science has never been able to find.
It allows continuity rather than sudden appearance. Still, this view raises a difficult question. If consciousness is a condition that appears wherever certain patterns exist, why does it feel so personal? Why does experience feel owned? Why is there a sense of me at all? The answer may lie in how the brain organizes experience around a single perspective. Memory, body awareness, and prediction create a center of gravity around which experience gathers. This center feels like a self, even if it is constructed. Consciousness itself may be neutral, but the brain gives it a location. It anchors experience to a body, a history, and a point of view. This anchoring makes awareness feel individual, even if its underlying nature is not. As we move forward, this distinction between consciousness and ownership will help clarify why awareness can feel both universal in quality and deeply personal in content, without forcing us to choose between brain-based and non-brain-based explanations.
When consciousness is seen as a condition rather than a thing, the question of ownership begins to soften. Experience feels personal because it is filtered through a specific body, a specific nervous system, a specific history. But the quality of awareness itself often feels neutral. Pain and pleasure differ, thoughts and emotions differ, but the simple fact of being aware does not seem to have a personality. It does not prefer one content over another. This neutrality is easy to miss because attention is usually captured by what appears, not by the space in which it appears. The brain plays a key role here. It selects, emphasizes, and organizes experience in ways that are useful for survival. It highlights threats, tracks goals, and reinforces identity. In doing so, it gives consciousness a shape that feels centered and personal. But this shape may not define the whole of awareness. It may define only its human expression. This helps explain why, in moments when attention relaxes, experience can feel less tightly bound to the self. Awareness remains, but its boundaries feel softer. The brain is still active, but it is no longer reinforcing a strong sense of ownership. This suggests that the self is something consciousness takes on, not something it is. The brain may be responsible for maintaining this role, keeping awareness focused and localized. Without that maintenance, consciousness does not disappear, it becomes less structured. This does not mean consciousness exists independently in a practical sense. Without the brain, there may be no way for awareness to take form as experience. But it does suggest that the brain's role is one of shaping and anchoring rather than creating from nothing. Consciousness may be the ground, and the brain may be the form it takes. This view does not close the question, it reframes it. Instead of asking where consciousness comes from, we begin to ask how it is shaped, limited, and expressed. As we continue, this shift will allow us to explore ideas that move beyond origin stories and toward a deeper understanding of how awareness and structure work together to produce the experience of being someone in a world.
As this perspective settles in, the original question begins to transform. Instead of asking whether consciousness is really the product of the brain, we start asking what kind of relationship could allow experience to exist at all. The brain is clearly necessary for human consciousness as we know it. Damage it, and experience changes. Shut it down, and experience fades. But necessity is not the same as explanation. Oxygen is necessary for fire, yet it does not explain why fire has heat and light. In the same way, the brain may be the condition that allows consciousness to appear in a specific form, without fully explaining why that form feels like something from the inside. This realization removes some of the tension from the debate. It allows us to hold two truths at once. Consciousness depends on the brain, and consciousness may not be reducible to brain activity alone. These statements do not cancel each other out. They describe different aspects of the same phenomenon. One describes structure, the other describes presence. When these are confused, the problem becomes impossible. When they are separated, the mystery becomes manageable. We stop expecting one level of description to do the work of another. The brain explains how experience is organized. Consciousness explains that experience is happening at all. This division does not solve the problem, but it clarifies it. It shows why progress has been slow, not because the question is flawed, but because it sits at the intersection of two very different ways of understanding reality. As we continue, this clarity will help guide the remaining parts of the discussion. The goal will not be to force a final answer, but to understand why consciousness may never fit into a single explanatory frame, and why that may be a feature of reality rather than a limitation of our thinking. As the discussion reaches this point, it becomes clear that consciousness may be one of those phenomena that cannot be captured from a single angle. Looking at it only through biology misses its immediacy. Looking at it only through experience misses its structure. The brain gives us maps, pathways, and mechanisms. Consciousness gives us presence, feeling, and meaning. Neither fully replaces the other. They describe the same reality from different sides. When we insist that one side must completely explain the other, something important is lost. The problem may not be that consciousness is mysterious, but that it sits exactly where our usual categories break down. It is not purely objective because it is never encountered from the outside. It is not purely subjective because it follows reliable patterns and depends on physical conditions. It exists at the boundary. This boundary is uncomfortable for explanation, but it is also where insight often appears. Consciousness forces us to question what we mean by explanation itself. Is explaining something the same as reducing it? Or can explanation also mean understanding relationships, conditions, and limits? If the latter is true, then progress does not require a final reduction of consciousness to neurons. It requires a clearer understanding of how experience and structure coexist. The brain may not answer why awareness exists, but it tells us how awareness takes form. Experience may not explain mechanisms, but it tells us what mechanisms are for. Together, they complete the picture. As we move forward, this balanced view will allow the question to remain alive without becoming frustrating. Consciousness does not need to be solved to be understood more deeply. It needs to be approached with patience, humility, and a willingness to let some aspects remain open. In that openness, the question continues to do its work, not by delivering a final answer, but by reshaping how we understand the mind, the brain, and the very idea of explanation itself. At this point, the question of consciousness no longer feels like something that can be settled by collecting more data alone. It begins to feel like a limit
we keep approaching from different angles. Every scientific description of the brain remains external. Neurons fire, networks synchronize, chemicals modulate attention and mood. These descriptions grow more detailed every year, yet they never cross a certain boundary. They never become experience itself. Consciousness is not something we observe happening. It is something we find ourselves already inside of. This creates a unique situation. We are trying to explain the very condition that allows explanation to happen. No other scientific problem works this way. When we study stars, we are not stars. When we study cells, we are not cells. But when we study consciousness, we cannot step outside of it. Every thought, every measurement, every interpretation already appears within awareness. This does not make the inquiry impossible, but it makes it fundamentally different. The brain can be described as an object in the world. Consciousness cannot. It is the field in which the world appears. Because of this, explanations based solely on object-like properties will always feel incomplete. They describe structure, correlation, and function, but they do not touch presence. This gap is not an error. It may be a signal that consciousness does not belong to the same category as the things we usually explain. Instead of being another phenomenon inside the universe, it may be the way the universe becomes knowable at all. Recognizing this does not stop inquiry. It slows it down. It shifts the goal from conquering the question to understanding why it resists closure. When consciousness is approached as a condition rather than a product, many contradictions begin to soften. Conditions are not things that suddenly appear. They are always already there, quietly allowing events to happen. Space allows movement. Time allows change. Consciousness may allow experience. From this view, the brain does not manufacture awareness the way a machine produces output. It shapes and limits awareness into a particular form. This helps explain why consciousness does not behave like a switch. It does not simply turn on or off. It expands, contracts, becomes focused or diffuse, but it rarely disappears completely. Even when awareness fades, there is often a sense of absence rather than nothingness. This suggests continuity. The brain seems to regulate access to experience rather than generate experience from nothing. When neural organization is coherent, experience feels unified. When it is fragmented, experience feels scattered. But the underlying capacity for experience remains. This also explains why consciousness appears gradual across evolution. There is no clear moment when awareness suddenly arrives. Instead, it becomes more structured as systems become more capable of integrating information across time. Consciousness, in this sense, may be what integrated information feels like from the inside. The brain provides the integration, consciousness provides the feeling. Neither alone is sufficient. This framing avoids treating awareness as mystical while also avoiding reducing it to a mechanical side effect. It places consciousness at the intersection of organization and presence, where structure and experience meet without collapsing into one another.
Seeing consciousness as relational changes how we understand its connection to the brain. The brain is not a container holding awareness, nor is consciousness a substance floating inside it. Instead, consciousness appears as something that unfolds through relationships. Neural activity shapes perception. Perception feeds back into neural activity. Attention changes brain patterns, and changed brain patterns reshape attention. This continuous loop makes it impossible to assign a single direction of causality. Consciousness is not produced at one end of the chain. It exists as the lived aspect of the chain itself. This explains why no single brain region can be identified as the seat of consciousness. Awareness is not localized because the processes that sustain it are distributed. Unity arises not from a central point, but from coordination. When coordination is strong, experience feels whole. When coordination weakens, experience fragments. Importantly, fragmentation does not usually eliminate awareness entirely. It alters its quality. This suggests that consciousness is sustained as a pattern over time, not as a static entity. Patterns can persist even as components change. This is why awareness can feel continuous even though the brain is constantly rewiring itself. Stability does not come from permanence, it comes from ongoing balance. Consciousness may be the felt quality of that balance, appearing whenever relationships hold together long enough to be experienced from the inside.
The more closely we examine consciousness, the more it challenges our assumptions about what counts as real. Physical objects occupy space. They have mass, boundaries, and locations. Consciousness has none of these properties, yet it is the most undeniable aspect of existence. Everything else is known through it. This inversion is easy to miss because we are trained to trust what can be measured over what is immediately felt. But consciousness reverses that hierarchy. It is immediately present, but difficult to measure. This does not make it less real. It makes it foundational. The brain exists as an object among objects. Consciousness is not one more object in the list. It is the condition under which objects appear as meaningful at all. Without consciousness, there would be no world as experienced. There would be processes, but no presence. This does not place consciousness outside science. It places it alongside science, as something science presupposes but does not fully capture. The brain gives us structure, limitation, and perspective. Consciousness gives us presence. One without the other would be incomplete. Treating consciousness as unreal because it lacks physical properties misunderstands its role. It is not competing with matter, it is revealing it. Recognizing this allows us to take consciousness seriously without turning it into something supernatural or detached from the physical world.
With this broader perspective, the original question finally settles into a quieter form. Is consciousness really the product of the brain? Or is the brain the way consciousness becomes shaped, localized, and personal? The evidence suggests that the relationship cannot be reduced to a single direction. Consciousness depends on the brain for its human expression. The brain depends on consciousness for meaning. Neither stands alone. The mistake may lie in trying to force one to fully explain the other. Consciousness may not be something that can be reduced without losing what makes it consciousness. This does not mean understanding is impossible. It means understanding must be layered. Neuroscience explains how experience is organized. Phenomenology describes what experience is like. Philosophy explores what experience implies about reality. None of these replaces the others. Together, they form a more complete picture. The question remains open not because we are ignorant, but because consciousness occupies a unique position. It is both what we investigate and what allows investigation. Accepting this does not end the inquiry. It stabilizes it. It allows curiosity to continue without the pressure of finality. Consciousness remains present whether or not we explain it fully. The brain remains essential whether or not it is the source. Holding both truths at once may be the most accurate position we have, not as a compromise, but as an honest reflection of how deeply intertwined structure and experience truly are.
At this depth of the discussion, it becomes impossible to ignore how deeply consciousness is tied to the sense of continuity. Experience does not feel like a series of disconnected moments. It feels like a flow. Even when attention shifts rapidly, there is a sense that something is carrying experience forward. This continuity is one of the strongest arguments against consciousness being a simple output of momentary brain activity. Neural signals are brief. They spike and fade in milliseconds. And yet, awareness feels extended. It feels as though moments overlap rather than replace one another. The brain appears to solve this by integrating information across time, binding past, present, and expectation into a single stream. Memory plays a central role here, but memory alone does not explain continuity. Memory explains recall, not presence. Consciousness feels present even when memory is quiet. This suggests that continuity may not be stored, but enacted. The brain may be continuously reconstructing a stable field of awareness by linking processes together just fast enough that gaps are never noticed. From the inside, this feels seamless. From the outside, it is astonishing. This also explains why disruptions to timing can feel deeply unsettling. When integration weakens, experience fragments. Time feels jumpy or unreal. Yet even in these states, awareness rarely disappears completely. Something remains that notices the disruption. This noticing seems more fundamental than the structure being disrupted. It is as if consciousness sits one level deeper than the processes that shape it. The brain organizes the flow, but the capacity for flow itself may not belong to any single mechanism. Understanding consciousness, then, may require understanding time not just as a physical dimension, but as a lived phenomenon, shaped by neural structure, but not reducible to it. When consciousness is examined through altered states, the relationship between brain activity and awareness becomes even more complex. In deep meditation, neural activity often becomes quieter and more synchronized, yet reports of awareness frequently describe clarity, openness, and intensity rather than dullness. In dreams, the brain generates vivid experiences while disconnected from external input. Under psychedelics, neural networks become less constrained and experience can feel expanded far beyond ordinary limits. These states do not fit neatly into the idea that more brain activity equals more consciousness. Instead, they suggest that how activity is organized matters more than how much of it there is. The brain appears to function as a filter, limiting experience to what is useful for survival under normal conditions. When that filter loosens, experience changes shape. This has led some researchers to propose that ordinary waking consciousness is not the maximum expression of awareness, but a constrained one. The brain narrows the field so that attention can focus, decisions can be made, and identity can remain stable. Consciousness itself may be broader than what we usually access. The brain, in this view, is not amplifying awareness, it is shaping and restricting it. This does not imply that consciousness exists independently in a practical sense. Without the brain, there may be no stable way for awareness to take form. But it does suggest that the brain's primary role may be regulation rather than production. Consciousness adapts to the limits imposed on it. When those limits shift, experience shifts accordingly. This flexibility challenges any model that treats consciousness as a fixed output tied directly to neural intensity.
The question of consciousness also becomes more interesting when we consider its apparent unity. Despite the brain being composed of billions of semi-independent components, experience feels singular. There is one point of view, one field of awareness. This unity does not appear to be constructed explicitly anywhere in the brain. There is no master neuron collecting all information. Instead, unity seems to emerge from coordination. When different processes communicate effectively, experience feels whole. When communication breaks down, unity dissolves. Conditions like dissociation, split brain phenomena, or certain neurological disorders reveal this clearly. Multiple streams of processing can coexist without forming a single conscious narrative. And yet, even then, some form of awareness persists. This suggests that unity is a feature added to consciousness, not consciousness itself. Consciousness may exist without unity, but unity cannot exist without consciousness. The brain appears to impose unity by synchronizing processes, creating the illusion of a single observer. This illusion is useful. It allows coherent action and identity, but it may not reflect the fundamental structure of awareness. Awareness itself may be more like a field that can host multiple perspectives when constraints loosen. The brain usually prevents this by enforcing coherence. This enforcement makes consciousness feel stable and singular, but it may not define its deepest nature. Again, the brain shapes the experience without necessarily creating the capacity for experience itself. The more closely we examine consciousness, the more it challenges our assumptions about what counts as real. Physical objects occupy space. They have mass, boundaries, and locations. Consciousness has none of these properties, yet it is the most undeniable aspect of existence. Everything else is known through it. This inversion is easy to miss because we are trained to trust what can be measured over what is immediately felt. But consciousness reverses that hierarchy. It is immediately present, but difficult to measure. This does not make it less real. It makes it foundational. The brain exists as an object among objects. Consciousness is not one more object in the list. It is the condition under which objects appear as meaningful at all. Without consciousness, there would be no world as experienced. There would be processes, but no presence. This does not place consciousness outside science. It places it alongside science, as something science presupposes but does not fully capture. The brain gives us structure, limitation, and perspective. Consciousness gives us presence. One without the other would be incomplete. Treating consciousness as unreal because it lacks physical properties misunderstands its role. It is not competing with matter, it is revealing it. Recognizing this allows us to take consciousness seriously without turning it into something supernatural or detached from the physical world.
By now, it becomes clear that the question, is consciousness really a product of the brain, may not have a clean yes or no answer. Consciousness does not behave like a product. It does not emerge suddenly, scale predictably, or exist independently as an object. At the same time, it does not float freely, untouched by physical structure. It is shaped, constrained, and localized by the brain in profound ways. The relationship appears to be one of co-emergence. Brain and consciousness arise together as two descriptions of a single process viewed from different sides. One description captures structure, the other captures experience. Neither replaces the other. Accepting this does not end inquiry, it deepens it. It allows us to study the brain without expecting it to answer every question about experience, and to explore consciousness without denying its dependence on biology. Consciousness may ultimately remain partially unexplained, not because of a failure of science, but because it is the ground on which explanation stands. It is what allows questions to be asked, evidence to be weighed, and understanding to occur. In that sense, consciousness does not need to be reduced to be respected. It needs to be approached carefully, patiently, and without the demand for final closure. And in that open space, the question continues to unfold, not toward an ending, but toward a deeper appreciation of how experience and structure coexist.
If consciousness were something fragile, something easily lost, the universe would feel very different from the inside. Yet awareness has a remarkable ability to persist even as conditions change. Bodies age, memories fade, attention weakens, and still there is a sense of being present. This persistence suggests that consciousness is not tied to any single function. It survives changes in perception, emotion, and identity. The brain, meanwhile, is constantly adapting. Neurons rewire, networks reorganize, chemistry shifts. From a physical standpoint, nothing stays still, and yet experience feels oddly stable. This contrast invites a deeper question. What exactly is being preserved? It may not be content. Thoughts and feelings come and go. It may not be identity. The sense of self can change dramatically. What remains is the capacity to experience at all. The brain appears to protect this capacity by maintaining certain global patterns. When these patterns hold, awareness continues. When they break down, awareness becomes distorted, but rarely erased completely. This suggests that consciousness may be more resilient than the structures that express it. The brain shapes experience, but it does not seem to own awareness in the same way it owns movement or reflex. Awareness feels less like a function and more like a condition that the brain maintains access to. This access can weaken, narrow, or fragment, but it is difficult to extinguish entirely. Even in states of extreme confusion or minimal responsiveness, traces of awareness often remain.
This resilience challenges any model that treats consciousness as a delicate byproduct. It behaves more like a stable background that can survive many kinds of disruption. Understanding this resilience may be more important than explaining origin, because it reveals how deeply consciousness is woven into the structure of experience itself.
Another feature of consciousness that resists reduction is its openness. Experience does not feel closed or complete. It feels unfinished, receptive, capable of holding more. This openness is not something the brain clearly measures or controls. It is felt directly. Awareness seems to have room. Thoughts arise and dissolve without filling it. Sensations come and go without exhausting it. This quality suggests that consciousness is not a limited resource produced in fixed quantities. It does not feel consumed by use. Instead, it feels like a space that remains available regardless of what passes through it. The brain, however, works very differently. It is finite. It tires. It consumes energy. It must regulate input carefully. This difference creates an interesting tension. The brain limits experience for efficiency, while consciousness feels limitless in capacity. Attention narrows awareness, not because awareness runs out, but because the brain focuses processing. When that focus relaxes, awareness feels wide again. This implies that consciousness itself may not be constrained in the same way physical systems are. The brain may act as a gatekeeper, selecting what enters experience and how strongly. Consciousness receives whatever passes through that gate. This model explains why reducing stimulation can sometimes increase clarity. Less is processed, but awareness remains fully present. It also explains why overstimulation can feel overwhelming. The gate is flooded, not because awareness is weak, but because the brain is overloaded. Consciousness does not collapse, it becomes crowded. Recognizing this difference between capacity and control helps clarify why consciousness feels spacious even within a very limited biological system. The sense that consciousness is always already present also changes how we think about beginnings and endings. From the inside, experience does not start with the brain's first thought of the day, nor does it clearly end when thoughts stop. Falling asleep, waking up, drifting into silence, these transitions feel gradual. Awareness does not flip like a switch. It fades, deepens, loosens, tightens. The brain shows clear state changes during these transitions, but experience itself feels more continuous. This continuity suggests that consciousness may not be bounded by discrete moments. It may be something that flows through changing states, rather than being recreated each time. If consciousness were produced moment by moment, we might expect gaps. Instead, we experience transitions. This implies that awareness may be sustained across time rather than generated anew. The brain may be constantly reconfiguring how experience appears, but not recreating the capacity for experience itself. This would explain why moments feel connected even when memory fails. Even without recall, there is still presence. The feeling of now does not require a past. It only requires awareness. The brain provides narrative and continuity of identity. Consciousness provides continuity of presence. These are not the same thing. Losing one does not automatically destroy the other. Understanding this distinction helps explain why consciousness can feel intact even when the story of self collapses.
It also explains why the fear of losing consciousness feels deeper than the fear of losing memory or identity. What we fear losing is not information, but presence itself. As the inquiry continues, consciousness begins to resemble less a mystery to be solved and more a perspective that cannot be removed. We cannot imagine the absence of consciousness in the same way we imagine the absence of objects. We can imagine darkness, silence, emptiness, but all of these imaginations still occur within awareness. Consciousness is not something that appears in experience, it is what experience appears in. This makes it resistant to comparison. The brain is one object among many. Consciousness is not another object added to the list. It is the condition under which lists exist at all. This does not make it supernatural, it makes it fundamental in a different way. Just as space is not located anywhere within space, consciousness may not be located anywhere within experience. The brain may localize experience, but not awareness itself. This perspective explains why attempts to locate consciousness in a specific brain region always fall short. They look for a thing where there may be only a condition. The brain can explain where signals are processed, where decisions are made, where memories are stored. It cannot point to awareness itself, because awareness is not processed, it is present. This does not place consciousness beyond understanding, it places it beyond objectification. Understanding may require accepting that some aspects of reality are not things to be found, but conditions to be recognized. By this stage, the original question has transformed almost completely. Asking whether consciousness is a product of the brain now feels like asking whether meaning is a product of language, or whether language is the way meaning becomes shared. The relationship is not one-directional. Consciousness and brain activity appear to arise together as two sides of the same unfolding process. One side is structural, measurable, and external. The other is experiential, immediate, and internal. Trying to reduce one to the other strips away what makes each distinct. Consciousness may not need to be produced to be real. It may simply need the right conditions to appear as experience. The brain provides those conditions in a highly refined way. This does not diminish neuroscience, it grounds it. It clarifies what neuroscience can and cannot claim. The brain explains how experience is shaped. Consciousness explains that experience is happening at all. Holding both truths together allows the inquiry to remain open without becoming vague. It respects evidence without forcing closure. Consciousness may remain partially unexplained, not because of failure, but because it is the background against which explanation itself unfolds. And in that sense, the question does not end here. It settles. It becomes quieter, deeper, and more stable, no longer demanding a final answer, but offering a clearer understanding of why the answer may never take a single, finished form.
At this stage, consciousness no longer feels like a problem that needs to be fixed or resolved. It begins to feel more like a fact that needs to be lived with carefully. Every attempt to fully explain it seems to circle back to the same realization. Whatever consciousness is, it is always already present before explanation begins.
This presence is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply remains. The brain, with all its complexity, appears to operate within this presence rather than generating it outright. Neural activity organizes, filters, and stabilizes experience, but awareness itself feels prior to any particular organization. This does not mean consciousness exists independently in a way we can separate from biology. It means that biology may be the way consciousness becomes specific. Without the brain, awareness may not take the form of a personal experience at all. But with the brain, awareness becomes localized, timed, and meaningful. This suggests a partnership rather than a hierarchy. Consciousness provides the capacity for experience. The brain provides the constraints that turn that capacity into a life. Understanding this partnership removes the need to force consciousness into familiar categories. It allows us to accept that some aspects of reality are not produced but revealed through structure. Consciousness may be one of those aspects, quietly present whenever conditions allow it to appear as experience.
The longer we stay with this question, the more it becomes clear that consciousness is not something that can be stepped away from. We can step away from beliefs, identities, even thoughts, but not from awareness itself. Even the idea of being unconscious is something we imagine while conscious. This makes consciousness unique. It is not one experience among others. It is the ground of all experience. The brain, in contrast, is something we can examine from a distance. We can point to it, describe it, alter it. Consciousness does not allow that distance. It is always the point from which distance is measured. This asymmetry explains why the question has remained unresolved for so long. We are not missing data. We are encountering a structural limit. Consciousness cannot be objectified without being transformed into something else. Brain scans show activity, not awareness. Reports describe experience, not presence itself. The mystery persists not because consciousness is hidden, but because it is too close. It is what is looking. Accepting this changes the tone of inquiry. The goal becomes understanding how consciousness behaves, how it relates to structure, how it changes under different conditions, rather than trying to capture it as a thing. This shift does not weaken understanding. It deepens it. It aligns explanation with the nature of what is being explained. As the inquiry settles into this quieter mode, another realization emerges. Consciousness does not seem to move forward in the same way physical processes do. The brain operates in time. Signals occur in sequence. States follow one another. Consciousness, however, feels anchored in the present. Even when remembering the past or imagining the future, experience happens now. This timeless quality gives awareness a different relationship to change. While the brain is constantly updating, consciousness feels steady. It does not accumulate in the same way memory does. It does not age. The sense of being aware feels the same now as it did earlier in life, even though everything else has changed. This suggests that consciousness may not be something that develops in content, but something that remains constant while content evolves. The brain provides narrative, memory, and progression. Consciousness provides immediacy.
Together, they create the feeling of a life unfolding through time. Without consciousness, time would have no presence. Without the brain, presence would have no story. This interdependence again points away from simple production models. Consciousness is not the end result of brain activity. It is the condition that allows activity to be experienced as happening at all. By now, the question of whether consciousness is produced by the brain has almost dissolved into a deeper understanding. The brain does not appear to manufacture awareness in the way it manufactures responses or behaviors. Instead, it shapes awareness into a usable form. It limits, focuses, and organizes experience so that it can support survival, learning, and identity. Consciousness itself feels broader than any one form it takes. This is why altered states can feel expansive, why silence can feel full, and why awareness often feels unchanged, even as the contents of life shift dramatically. The brain may act like a lens, bringing something vast into focus. Without the lens, there may be no image at all, but the image is not the lens. This metaphor is imperfect, but it captures the balance. Consciousness without structure may be inaccessible. Structure without consciousness would be meaningless. Together, they create the lived world. Understanding this balance removes the pressure to choose sides. The question was never about proving one view wrong. It was about seeing the relationship more clearly. In the end, the most honest answer may be the quietest one. Consciousness is not something the brain simply produces, nor is it something that floats free of physical reality. It is what reality feels like from the inside when the right conditions are present. The brain provides those conditions in a highly refined way, allowing awareness to take shape as a personal, continuous experience. Consciousness, in turn, allows the brain's activity to matter, to be known, to be lived. This mutual dependence does not resolve the mystery, it stabilizes it. It shows why the question remains meaningful without demanding a final conclusion. Consciousness does not need to be solved to be respected. It needs to be approached with care, patience, and humility. It remains present before, during, and after every explanation. And perhaps that is the final insight. Consciousness is not waiting at the end of inquiry. It is what inquiry happens within. The brain may explain many things about how experience is shaped, but consciousness explains why there is experience at all. Holding that understanding gently allows the question to rest, not as something unfinished, but as something complete in its openness. As we come to the end of this session, there's nothing you need to take with you. No ideas to hold on to, no thoughts to finish. The words can fade, just like the day slowly does. If you found this space calming, you can leave a like or subscribe to the channel. It quietly supports more moments like this. For now, let everything settle. You don't need to listen closely anymore. The sound can stay even as attention drifts away. Rest easy and let time continue gently on its own.